Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. And joining us is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, happy Easter and welcome.
Hey, Brandon, happy Easter to you. How are all the kidlies doing, especially little Gilbert?
They're doing very well. Thanks for asking. We're recording this just a few days after Easter, about a week after Easter, and we haven't had a chance to catch up and hear. I want to hear how Holy Week went for you. This is your third Holy Week now as bishop. So fill us in. What was Holy Week like this year?
Well, I usually go around the different parishes in my region during Holy Week. And this year we did some recordings as well. We got our Word on Fire team out there and recorded these liturgies. So Palm Sunday and Holy Thursday, Good Friday. I didn't do the vigil because I like leaving that for the pastors. It's an important thing for the pastor to be receiving those to be baptized and confirmed and so on. But then, of course, Easter Sunday I did. And, it's always a joy. I went to different places all around this big region that I have. So a lot of different, economic situations and different kinds of communities, et cetera. But a lot of enthusiasm, good numbers. Think about LA, we're the biggest archdiocese in the country. And so things tend to be big out here. Whenever you go for liturgies and all that, you get good crowds. So it was, very uplifting for me.
Did you do any of the liturgies in Spanish this Holy Week?
Oh, yeah. Typically, I'd say half my liturgies out here would be in Spanish. I preached in Spanish for, was it good? No, it wasn't good for, it was a Holy Thursday. I did the sermon in Spanish. It was a great parish in Oxnard, which is the most populous part of my region. There were 5 parishes, all huge in Oxnard. And that Mass was all Spanish, and I preached in Spanish. Then I did some confirmations this past weekend. Both Masses were in Spanish. So I'm getting pretty good at that. And I can preach if I have the text prepared, which is not my usual way of preaching. I usually work just some notes that I've sort of memorized. So I'm trying to reach that point with Spanish. I'm not quite there yet.
Well, Bishop, today I want to talk about an exciting event that took place just before Holy Week. It was right in the midst of your month-long, grueling travel period there. We went to Washington, D.C. for the USCCB meeting, and then we flew to Los Angeles to go to the LA Religious Congress. But then right after that, you and myself and Joseph Glore, our producer, went up to Mountain View, California. It's right outside of San Francisco because you were invited to give a talk at the headquarters of Google. We got a tour of Google's campus. We got to tour YouTube. YouTube is owned by Google, and they have their headquarters not too far down the road. And then you gave a talk there. So I wanted to recap that visit and then more specifically recap your talk there, which was titled Religion and the Opening Up of the Mind. So first of all, let's talk about the tour. What were your initial impressions of Google and YouTube?
Oh, it was cool. It reminded me of the trip to Facebook, which is, again, not far from there. And I've said, if you gave a millennial all the money in the world and said, now build your universe, you'd find these places, the Google and Facebook headquarters. They're fun. They're full of, they have gyms and they have playrooms and they have music rooms and they have little nap pods in the office area if you want to take a quick nap. Food every place. Young people galore. So I always feel like Methuselah when I go to these places. I'm this ancient of days because I think the average age of the people is probably 28 or something, right? So anyway, they're fun. I've enjoyed the visits a lot, and they were wonderful people that received us and gave us the tour. And you think as you walk through those places, some of the most culturally influential institutions in the world right now are right there. So it was fun. It was moving.
I remember we were walking through the YouTube offices and one of the young tour guides took us by this virtual reality studio or station. And he said, "Oh, that's my office." And you said, "Oh, that's your office." And you kind of just walked into the room and there was 2 or 3 of his coworkers there who kind of looked up with deer in their head in the headlight eyes, seeing this Catholic bishop coming into YouTube.
Well, as I remember, the little beards and glasses and the knit cap, and they looked like perfect millennials. And right, I come in with my black suit and the pectoral cross, and they thought, "Who in the world is this?" But no, they received us very warmly.
One of the exciting, cool parts of the get together was we got to have lunch with a lot of the Catholic Googlers. That's what they call themselves. And so we had a lot of good conversation. I know you were sitting around with a number of them who were involved with these driverless cars that Google is investing in. And you were particularly taken by that technology. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's great being with these young, I call them young kids. That might insult them, but they're, in their 20s and super smart. And this was a Catholic group, and they take their faith seriously. A lot of them are doing this kind of virtual rosary. They would pray together, online. But I began asking about the driverless cars because there was the controversy just around then of the person who was killed down in Arizona. So I was asking about, the technology, the dangers. And I said, well, we're looking at 25, 50 years? And they went, oh gosh, no, a lot sooner than that. More like 10 years. And I've been thinking about that, I must say. I'm not sure I'm quite ready for that world, but they're working on it.
Well, before we get into your talk, the talk that you delivered at Google's headquarters, I want to talk a little bit more about YouTube. Google, of course, is significant for all sorts of reasons, but I think visiting YouTube was especially poignant for you, given the significance of YouTube for your ministry. What was that like?
Yeah, it was good. Same thing. We were very warmly received by some nice young people that took us around the YouTube headquarters. And mind you, it was a week later that there was a shooting at that very place. So you and I both were kind of remarking, it was a close call 1 week after we were there. But yeah, YouTube, we started putting videos up on YouTube pretty much from the beginning. I think it began in 2006. We started 2007. So we were kind of on the ground floor at YouTube. And, say what you want about it. And they have videos of every possible variety. But they've allowed us to do some I think, powerful evangelical work, and we've used it as a tool for the church. And so I'm grateful for that and happy for this technology, which has been extremely useful for the church.
So when you went to go speak at Facebook a few months ago, we live streamed your talk. It was on how to have a religious argument. The Google event was a little different. They recorded the talk. They didn't want us to live stream it. So they said it'll be available here in about a month or so. We'll be sure to share that with everyone. But the topic you chose for your Google talk was titled Religion and the Opening Up of the Mind. So first of all, why that topic?
Because there's such a prejudice, I think, against religion as superstitious, as pre-rational, sub-rational. It's the way primitive people think, and it's science that has opened up our mind and all this. And I'm arguing just the contrary, that what I think shuts down the mind is this ideological secularism or materialism that locks us in the buffered self and says all that is real is what we can empirically verify and experiment on. I mean, I love the sciences, but that's a very, very restricted view of reality. I go back to Plato's Republic and the myth of the cave, and escaping from simply the realm of the empirically verifiable is key to the philosophical life. Well, then see, I would say a fortiori, even more powerfully, religion represents the opening up of the mind as far as it can, because the mind, and this was the heart of my argument, is a search engine, and I use that on purpose at Google. It's a search engine. It's always questing. It's restless. The mind is not just passive and receptive. It actively seeks what it wants, right? And what does it want? Well, it wants the truth. But how much truth? Well, not just this or that. I mean, pick now any area of interest, science or literature or the arts or whatever it is. Yeah, the mind wants the truth. And the more it gets, the more it wants, right? The more answers you get, the more questions open up, and the mind keeps searching. It's like a mountain that we keep climbing. If we rest only to catch our breath and continue climbing. And I said that Aquinas called that the intellectus agens, right? The agent intellect or the questing intellect. See, what's it finally after is not just any particular truth or set of particular truths. What the mind wants finally is the unconditioned truth. It wants, and there's Lonergan's language, to know everything about everything. It wants the truth itself. See? Now, the shorthand term for that is God. Now, put that in religious language. What the mind wants is the beatific vision. It wants to see God in the face. That's a poetic way of saying what I've just been describing, right? So my argument there was, I love the Google search engine sort of thing because it's born of this dynamism of the mind. But religion is what opens up and energizes that dynamism. It doesn't shut it down. In fact, on the contrary, it's secularism and materialism that shut down the questing mind. So that was my basic presupposition.
You referenced Thomas Aquinas, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that idea of the intellectus agens, the agent intellect. Tell us a little bit more about that and how it works.
Well, if you do the full Thomistic epistemology, that just is a fancy way of saying his account of how we know, right? Thomas agrees with Aristotle that knowledge begins in the senses. So we open up our eyes and our ears and we touch things and we see things. So it begins with the senses. But then the imagination holds that sense image in the mind. Like, so now you start to contemplate something you've seen. Think of a scientist here who's contemplating a set of phenomena, right? Set of data. So the senses take it in, the imagination holds on to it. But now the intellectus agens starts working. And the agent intellect asks us questions stubbornly. And in Thomas's Latin, the question is, quid sit? What might that be? What's that? What is that thing? And so it wonders and it asks and it searches. Now, put it in scientific language, it experiments, it hypothesizes, right? Good. That's all the work of the intellectus agens. And then when it discovers, okay, that's what that thing is or what that phenomenon is, it then keeps asking the question and keeps asking the question, ever refining what something is. Now, I'll cut to the chase. Someone who is examining a dog, right? So you see this phenomenon, this animal, and you begin asking, what is that? What is that? Well, that's a dog. Well, what's a dog? Well, dog's a type of mammal. Well, what's a mammal? A mammal's a type of animal. What's an animal? That's a type of physical reality. Well, what's a physical reality? That's a type of being. What does it mean to be? You see what I just did there is with a set of 5 or 6 questions I got from seeing a dog on the beach to asking about God ultimately. Because what does it mean to be? What's the source of being? Where's being come from? By 5 or 6 questions prompted by the intellectus agens, I came from the dog to a consideration of God. And that's the way the Thomistic approach works. So that's why I'm saying it's the God question that opens up the mind, doesn't close it down.
I noticed how at no point in that progression did you just say, well, it just is. That's just the way things are.
Right. Until you get where? Until you get to ipsum esse, right? The sheer act of to be itself. Because only when you get there can the mind say, okay, I've now reached the point where I've understood that which exists through the power of its own essence. And that's the way Catholic philosophy characterizes God. God is not a derived or participating or dependent form of existence, but God is what it means to be. To be God is to be. What's your name? I am who I am, right? And so the mind, as it were, rests. I put that in quotes because this side of death, we never see clearly what we're talking about. We point toward it, we gesture toward it. But the mind rests only in that which exists through the power of its own essence, only in God.
I'm talking with Bishop Robert Barron about his recent lecture that he gave at the headquarters of Google about a few weeks ago to about a room full of 100 Google employees, titled Religion and the Opening Up of the Mind. So you began there, Bishop, with an opening section on your most serious objection to secularism and atheism, which is that they involve the shutting down of the mind. But then you illustrated this principle with a biblical story, that of Elijah and the priests of Baal. Why did you bring that in?
Well, first of all, I love that story, and I've used it in a lot of different contexts. And I thought it was an interesting way to get at this issue because you know the story well. When Elijah, the one priest of Yahweh, challenges the 450 priests of Baal, that we'll each call upon our respective deities and we'll see which one answers, right? So the priests of Baal set up their altars and then they call upon their gods and there's no answer. And they call throughout the day, no answer. Noon comes, still no answer. And Elijah mocks them. You know, where are these gods of yours? Maybe they're on vacation. Maybe they're taking a nap. And then they get so frustrated, they begin to slash themselves, begging their gods to respond. And then, of course, Elijah calls upon Yahweh, and the fire comes and devours the sacrifice. Well, there's so much more in that story than just a kind of, hey, I'm tougher than you are. It's on this point, see. Think of the begging of both the priests of Baal and Elijah as expressions of the human spirit, if you want, of the intellectus agens, right? The questing mind, the questing heart. What are the altars now erected to the Baals, but all those false paths that we take? As we're seeking to satisfy the deepest hunger of the heart, we seek it in wealth and in sensual pleasure and in power and worldly honor, etc., right? But what's the point? The point is the fire never falls when you do that, because those things are not meant to satisfy the deepest longing. The priests of Baal represent the stuck spirit, right? The mind or the heart that's stuck. Elijah represents now the mind and heart ordered to God. And it's only that ordering that causes the fire to fall. And so that's the story I told. I think a lot of people, and that's true in the day of Elijah, it's true today. A lot of people are like the priests of Baal. They spend their lives hopping around altars, and they waste their time and end up harming themselves. There's the cutting and the bleeding. Think of all the forms of addiction that follow from this false quest. So that was the point I was making there, is that's still the relevant question. Whom do you worship? How do you worship? How do you direct the deepest longing of your heart? And don't waste your time on these proximate worldly goods, but order your life to God, see? So and that's why that story, I think, is still of enormous significance.
For the rest of your talk, you turned your attention to these false substitutes, these things that we hunger after, we think that will satisfy the longing we have for happiness, but that don't. And you focus on the four famous false substitutes of Aquinas: wealth, power, pleasure, and honor. Let's walk through each of those maybe briefly and just talk about why they can't satisfy our deepest hunger. So first of all, wealth. Why can't wealth be the greatest good?
Well, Aquinas says that one form of wealth, called like natural wealth, think of all those things that satisfy our physical needs, right? So think someone's wealthy. What do they have access to? Well, they have access to a house that makes them protected and comfortable, access to food that gives them pleasure, access to all the things that make their lives comfortable, right? That's what wealth can do. Well, okay, nothing really wrong with that. But then Aquinas says, when you've got all that in place, then what? Well, then you really are awakened to the deeper and higher joys of life. Now you can enter into friendship and into contemplation and into ethical achievement, right? And so wealth could never be the final good. It's not what's finally luring the will. At best, wealth can be a sort of proximate or means to an end, but it can never be the end in itself.
I think the great example of this is to look at it the other way. The people like the saints who were the least wealthy, I'm thinking of the mendicants, the Francises, the Mother Teresas of the world, have this inordinate joy and happiness. So at least in their case, wealth clearly wasn't the source of their joy.
Yeah, and of course, what you're seeing there in those forms of asceticism are powerful examples of people who, in a public way, are witnessing to the importance of eliminating this as your final good. See, it's not as though God is sort of sadistic and God wants to deny us all kinds of pleasures. That isn't the point. The point is we can discipline ourselves and act as a public witness to that discipline for the benefit of others. And now you see all the great ascetic figures.
Okay, so wealth can't be the source of our ultimate happiness. It's not the answer of the questing intellect. But what about power? Can power be the ultimate source of good?
It can't. And it's very simple to say why. Because power is a means, and what we're talking about is the ultimate end. Now, see what I mean there? Power. Power means I've got a capacity to do things, right? If I have power, I can go where I want, I can do what I want, I can command what I want, right? Great. Okay, in itself, nothing wrong with that. But it means it's a means to a further end. I have power to do X, Y, or Z, right? I have power to attain A, B, or C. What we're talking about here, the ultimate lure of the will, can't be a means, it has to be an end. So power can never be an end in itself. Like, let's say, for example, you had all power, like you were living alone on the planet Mars. You got all the power in the world. Well, so what? Because you can't really attain what you want with it. I got it. No one's going to limit me. No one's going to tell me I can't do it, but I can't accomplish what I really want with that power. So power is a source, not an end. That's why it can't be the ultimate lure of the will.
So it can't be wealth. It can't be power. I think probably the most popular substitute for God in this regard is the next one, which is pleasure. Whether that be sexual pleasure, the pleasure from food, therapeutic pleasure, good feelings. We all chase pleasure thinking, okay, that's what it's all about. But why can't pleasure ultimately satisfy?
And, I'll say this, first of all, that there's a good, serious argument for pleasure being the ultimate end. And, we have a hedonistic philosophy, which has been around for a long time. And I don't mean that in some crude way, like it's just, sexual pleasure or just pleasure of food and drink. People talk about refined sort of pleasures, the pleasure I take in fine arts and that sort of thing. But see, again, here's the problem. The problem is that pleasure is not an end in itself. Pleasure is a kind of side effect. Right. So think of when I've had a good meal and I've drunk enough and so on, a pleasurable feeling accompanies that as kind of a sign of it. Or when I've taken in a beautiful work of art, I might have a kind of a rush of pleasure. But the pleasure is not what I want. The pleasure is a kind of after effect or a sign or a symptom, if you want, of what's really substantive. So let's say, I'm listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and as I'm listening to it, I'm taking in all of its richness and complexity. I have this sort of rush of good feeling, Great, nothing wrong with that, again. But that's not a substitute for Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Like, let's say I could take that rush of good feeling and I could somehow create a pill that would produce that feeling in me. So without watching or listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, without watching a baseball game, without reading a great book, without having a conversation and a great friendship, I take this pill, which gives me that same feeling. Would that be what I want? See, and the question answers itself. That's not what I want. I want the thing, I want the relationship. I want the symphony. I want the baseball game, not the pleasure that comes as a side effect or symptom of the thing. So that's why pleasure can't be the ultimate good.
I think we see confirmation in this in our culture's general frustration and sorrow over the opioid epidemic, that we do have pills like the one you described that produce euphoria and happiness, but nevertheless, we all think that that's not good for people to take those.
It's 1984, the great George Orwell novel. I mean, it's the same thing. If we could refine that pill, would we take it? And it's reflective people and spiritually serious people will say, well, no, that's not it. That's not what you want.
Okay, so we looked at three of these false substitutes that Thomas Aquinas proposes, wealth, power, pleasure. Let's look at the fourth one. Again, you're talking to Google employees about the questing mind and what will ultimately satisfy it. It can't be wealth, it can't be power, it can't be pleasure. What about honor?
Yeah, and honor is a very alluring thing. And talk to a lot of people that maybe can eschew the first three relatively easily, but honor, right? I mean, titles and position, recognition, being highly thought of, being given the position that you think you deserve. I mean, all of that is deeply alluring to us. Well, again, like the other three, honor is not bad in itself. We speak of God being honored, right? We give honor to Christ. But what's honor? Aquinas says honor is a flag of virtue. So if someone's virtuous or good or noble, we put a flag on him or her. We say, hey, look, that person is worthy of imitation. That person you should pay attention to. The trouble with the addiction to honor is you become preoccupied with the flag rather than with the substance which the flag is identifying. Does that make sense? And see, in a way, honor is not for you. It's for others. So if I do something that's honorable, that's noble and good and so on, and someone plants a flag on me and says, hey, look at him. It's not for me, that flag. It's for others, right? So it's weird and perverse if I get attached to the stupid flag, which is meant to signal to others to imitate some virtue that I have. So again, the substance of it is the virtue, not the flag. It's the nobility that the flag indicates that ought to be the end of our searching.
So we've got this endlessly questing mind and these infinite caverns of our heart that are longing to be fulfilled, and they can't be satisfied with wealth, power, pleasure, honor. What can satisfy them?
And there's the high paradox. And so Aquinas, I'm just following his analysis in the very beginning of the second part of the Summa. Nothing created can satisfy a properly infinite desire. See, and we realize that the more we reflect upon it, the desire, the longing of our mind, the longing of our will is infinite. It's endless. I want to know everything about everything. I want not a particular good, but goodness itself. That means that nothing in this world could ever satisfy that longing, but only, as Aquinas says, only the infinite God. So, riffing there on the Psalm, it's only in God that my soul is at rest. It's one of the most important statements in the Bible. Only in God will my soul be at rest. The infinite longing must be ordered to the infinite good. And that's what the sacrifice of Elijah means, doesn't it? Is that he alone has linked his sacrifice to the infinite good. Now, order your life to God, and you'll find, here's the cool thing, that your other desires fall into place. So do we have desires for wealth, pleasure, power, honor? Yeah, sure. And they're not bad in themselves, as I've said. But see, now, if I'm desiring God above all things, I know what to do with my wealth. If I'm blessed with wealth, I'll know what to do with it. If I'm blessed with power, I'm put in a position of power, I'll know what to do with that power. I'm not going to abuse it for my own ends. Honor, even how do I use the honor given to me? Like a good example, there's Mother Teresa, I think, who was a deeply, deeply honored person, right? Maybe the most honored person on the planet for the last maybe 30 years of her life. Living saints, greatest person, Nobel Peace Prize, right? But see, the genius was she knew what to do with that honor. She didn't, bask in it and aggrandize her ego because of it, but she used that honor as a flag to draw attention to the work that she was doing, So that's a very important principle, is when the desires are properly ordered, then they fall into place in a happy manner and not a self-destructive manner.
You closed your talk at Google by quoting that famous line from St. Augustine's Confessions that, Lord, you have made us for yourself. Therefore, our heart is restless until it rests in thee. Talk about the significance of that line.
His riff on the Psalm, right? Only in God my soul's at rest. And see, Augustine's Confessions, which everyone should read. If you've read it already, read it again. You read it 5 times, read it a 6th time. It's that important a book, I think. But it's the story of someone who was questing, whereas the song says, looking for love in all the wrong places, right? It's a story of a guy who was very interested in wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. That's the first part of the Confessions. It's all about that young, bright, ambitious, talented kid who wanted all the things that all of us sinners want. And he went down one dead-end path after another, until he found the God in whom his soul could be at rest. And he confesses, and that means not just confession of sin, which is part of it, because when you walk down those paths, that's what sin is all about, right? But it's also a profession of praise that he's discovered, or better, that God's discovered him, in whom his soul would find rest. And so, Lord, you made us for yourself. You see, the other day I was reflecting on this. I was walking on the beach here, and there's this dog, and the owner has the ball at the end of that stick, where they throw and there's the dog, and he's looking up at the ball that's about to be thrown, and the look of sheer rapture on the face of the dog. I said, see, heaven will be like that. Because, see, that dog at that moment was realizing his doggy nature. Do you know what I'm saying? He exists to run and to play and to be loved by his master. And That was it. That dog was in heaven. That dog had accomplished everything he's meant to accomplish. But see, we're not like that. We have that element that the dog has, but we have so much more, which is this, yes, sometimes deeply frustrating desire for God. See, which means that even as I'm having the most fun I've ever had on the beach, I'm not going to be like that dog. I'm going to say, yeah, and there's something missing. You know, I have the greatest success I have ever wanted in business or with my family, and yet I'm not satisfied. See, that's the restless heart, because it was made for God, and therefore only in God is it at rest. There's nothing more important in our anthropology than that.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our wonderful listeners. If you have a question, please record it and send it in by visiting askbishopbarron.com. Today we get to hear from Dan, who asks a question about the resurrection, which is very timely given that we're here in the Easter season. Here's Dan.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Dan from Detroit, Michigan, and my question today is about the time after the resurrection. Why did Jesus show himself only to a few people and not to the Pharisees, Pontius Pilate, or a large crowd? Thank you, and God bless.
Yeah, Dan, it's a good question. A lot of people have raised it over the centuries. And here's a first observation. He did appear, we're told, to a large crowd. So remember, we have that account in, is it 1 Corinthians, when Paul talks about he appeared first to Simon, then to the 12, and then a crowd of 500 brothers at once. And then finally, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. So what was that appearance? We don't really know. What's being talked about? We're not sure. But there seemed to have been a large crowd to whom he appeared. So there's that. But more pointedly, John Henry Newman raised your question in one of his famous sermons. Like, why didn't he just appear to everybody? Just get up on the top of the Mount of Olives and say, hey, everyone, here I am, the risen Jesus, and here are my wounds, and, everyone believe in me. Well, Newman's point was this, that Jesus wasn't there simply to impress people or wow them with this amazing miracle. His purpose was evangelization, right? So go and teach all nations, he tells his apostles. So he chose people, he appeared to people who knew him, who understood him from the inside, who had traveled with him, who knew his mind and heart, who loved him, right, as friends. And they would form thereby, Newman says, the sort of spearhead of evangelization. If he appeared like just to everybody, well, what sense would they make of it, or what's going on, or who is that again, and what's he all about? They might have seen it simply as something kind of odd and wonderful that would be forgotten about promptly. But with the disciples, it became something of enormous world-transforming power. So that's one way to get at that question, I think.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, for your question, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they did record Bishop Barron's talk at Google, so we'll be sharing that as soon as it's available on YouTube. Also, many of you have been asking how you can get involved with the Word on Fire movement that Bishop Barron keeps talking about. It was mentioned in his latest book. Well, now there's a way. We've created the Word on Fire community, which is not necessarily a way to be part of a canonical movement yet, but is a way to plug in with Bishop Barron and many others around the world who are excited about this movement. So if that sounds interesting to you, just go to wordonfire.org/community to join in. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.